The federal appeals court rules that short-barreled rifles aren't arms. Plus, Senator Mike Crapo discusses silencer deregulation and the GOP's plan for gun policy. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. And before we jump into some of the big news stories we want to talk about this week, we also wanted to just update some of you listeners about some formatting changes we're going to be making in this podcast going forward. Every so often, we want to kind of change it up by throwing in, some maybe shorter interviews with some interesting guests, or having some guest segments coming on and folks that kind of share our worldview and our mission, that they can update us on what they're working on. And this episode should be one of the first test cases of that, right, Steve?
Yeah. So I think we'll just try to mix things up a little bit. We've been doing the show for a while. We started off right with one big episode with the interview and then the news update all in one. And we split those into two different things. And we're still going to keep the interview episodes the same. Those are the ones that'll, you get early if you're a Reload member, have early access to those on Sunday. We've got, we actually have the New York Times gun beat writer, the new gun beat writer over there, Thomas Gibbons-Neff, is going to be on the show this week. So members will get that on Sunday. Everyone else will be able to listen on Monday. That'll stay the same, but we want to add in, mix up this show a little bit, add in some shorter interviews occasionally. We're starting off here with Idaho Republican Senator Mike Crapo, who's introduced. He's the sponsor of the Hearing Protection Act in the Senate. So, we had on his colleague in the House, Rep. Hudson from North Carolina, a little while back, talk about his view of where Congress is going on this stuff. And so we wanted to have somebody similar from the Senate. I'd love to get some Democrats on here too, give their view on this. We've talked a little bit about them and how it doesn't seem like the party has shifted much on gun policy, but I'd be interested in having, a representative from the other side of the aisle come on and give their perspective too. But this week we're starting with Senator Crapo. We're going to do I think just have a recurring segment of shorter interviews to tag on to the end of the news update. Mostly, I think there'll be more recurring segments, like active self-protection is going to come on every so often, maybe once a month, and give maybe the most interesting self-defense story that they've profiled over on their podcast and their channel. Mike Wilverge does a podcast with me. For anybody who hasn't heard of it before, we do one over on their podcast. We have the ASP News podcast. He calls it the Gutowski Files. So that's a good time. But, we'd like to have him on here and give us some insight into some of the badge cams they're doing, or just self-defense videos that they're working on every week, because they do really interesting stuff. And it's not our specialty, but it's certainly, I think, in the realm of what you guys might want to hear about. Same thing for the Humble Marksman. We had him on a couple of weeks ago on the main podcast, and he does gun reviews. We don't do gun reviews, really. We'll talk about gun stuff a little bit sometimes, but it'd be nice to have the perspective of somebody who does gun reviews professionally come on and share their most interesting, gun of the month, or whatever. And I think that's something we're going to work towards for this show. And it's going to start this week with that Senator Crapo interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting into some of our stories of the week. The big one that we want to talk about is one that you wrote up. Interesting ruling out of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, where a 3-judge panel ruled that short-barreled rifles, which are regulated under the National Firearms Act, are not actually arms as considered by the Second Amendment and are not protected by the Second Amendment.
Yeah, so we've seen this argument before, right? In other cases, even in the 7th Circuit, actually saw this as the reason why the Illinois assault weapons ban is constitutional, according to the 7th Circuit. Obviously, Justice Clarence Thomas had an issue with that and expressed his distaste for that finding in when the Supreme Court declined to take up the case, at least early on in the process. They, not necessarily. He claimed that it was because they're waiting for to intervene at a later point down the line of the case's progress. But yes, in this case, and it's actually, I think, on more solid footing, this claim surrounding short barrel rifles specifically, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but basically they said, these aren't arms because of Supreme Court precedent, actually, which comes from 1939. There was a case called U.S. v. Miller, which tested the constitutionality of the National Firearms Act as it applied to short barrel shotguns, and found that basically short barrel shotguns are not protected arms under the Second Amendment because, and this part is going to be where it starts to sound familiar, because they're not in common use in the way that the firearms that the Second Amendment meant to protect during the founding era for militiamen would have been in common use by the average person at the time. So, they said basically that was the foundation of their ruling. They didn't really need to say anything more than that. That settles the case. The charges against this Midwestern man. I don't know what state, by the way, Rush is. This case is U.S. v. Rush. I don't know where Rush is from. They don't say in the ruling, but we know the Seventh Circuit covers, I think it's Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. So that's, I think, indisputably the Midwest. But his charges can move forward. He pled guilty to this offense and received a 30-month sentence. So pretty heavy punishment when this was, as far as I could tell, at least what they discussed, this is the only crime that they talk about in the case. It wasn't necessarily associated with anything else. He just had a short barrel rifle. It was an AR-15, an Anderson manufacturing. It's not even a particularly expensive. That would be a very inexpensive AR-15. But either way, he didn't have the proper paperwork, essentially. He didn't pay the NFA tax or have the registration required under the National Firearms Act. And so, but interestingly, they found that Miller, just relying on Miller was enough because they argued that it hasn't been overturned by the later Second Amendment cases the Supreme Court has handed down, like Heller or Bruin. So that was, according to this panel, it's a 3-judge panel. They were all appointed by, actually all by President Biden. That was just kind of a rare panel draw. But either way, they concluded that was all was needed to answer the question in the case. However, they decided to go on and do a Bruin analysis anyway, because the defendant in the case, Rush, had claimed that Bruin did overturn Miller, essentially, or effectively. And so they did a Bruin analysis, and they found, perhaps unsurprising if you've been listening up to this point, that the NFA's short barrel rifle restrictions, the tax and registration requirement, essentially, do not violate the Second Amendment under the Bruin test, primarily because there's a historical tradition of regulating firearms in a similar way from the founding era. Mostly they point to militia regulations that existed at the founding for barrel length, and they point to some taxes that had been levied against firearms around the founding period. A lot of the history that you actually will find in Miller itself that they point to in that case to establish this idea that only guns that were useful in militia service are protected, and therefore and the guns that were useful in militia service, you can figure out what those are by looking at what guns were in common use, because every man was considered to be part of the militia and he was supposed to show up with his own firearms. So therefore, the kind of guns he might have shown up with are the kind of guns that would be protected by the Second Amendment. That was sort of the Miller holding. And that's where we get the in common use standard. And The dangerous and unusual standard comes from that as well. And so, they determined that these restrictions, they also pointed to the fact that these are not an outright ban, at least not the short barrel rifle regulations in the NFA, right? The machine gun section has become an outright ban over time in the 1980s, but the short barrel rifle regulations are still not an outright ban. They are a tax and registration requirement. And they said that makes them a lower standard. The Supreme Court had already accepted the constitutionality of permitting schemes, for instance, in Bruin, at least the less onerous permitting schemes of shall issue, concealed carry permitting, for instance. And taxes and other regulations are less onerous than outright bans, according to the Supreme Court. And so, they were looking at this as these, even if you consider short barrel rifles to be protected arms, they're claiming that these are lesser burdens on the ability to own them, and that they comport with the historical tradition of regulating the length of barrel, that's similar to regulations that existed during the founding era. And so it's constitutional. That's where the court came down in this case.
Yeah, certainly deals a blow to gun rights advocates that obviously want to get rid of the NFA. It's one of their longtime goals, but it is a nice reminder that Miller is still technically a good law. A lot of people, we like to think of the modern second crop of Second Amendment cases just because there was such a gap. And it can be easy to forget that in 1939, there was a Second Amendment precedent, and the Supreme Court has never explicitly overruled it or said it's no longer valid law. And instead, they kind of built off of it and sort of inferred things from it into Heller that then built into Bruin. But it's still on the books. And this is sort of the result you're going to get from that.
I mean, that's the thing about Miller is that core holding about, and I don't even know if this really, what Heller took as the core holding of Miller, at least we'll say that, is essentially the bedrock of Second Amendment jurisprudence at the Supreme Court now. That Miller's holding was basically that the short barrel shotgun, and that was another thing the Seventh Circuit said, basically, that we don't see really a difference between Miller's case and Rush's case, because short barrel shotguns and short barrel rifles are effectively it's the same concept here in the same law, regulated in the same way. Although I will note that the short barrel rifle regulations have actually changed since 1934, when the NFA was passed, because the government ended up being accidentally the biggest violator of the NFA in history, because they sold a bunch of M1 carbines after World War II, which M1 carbines, initially the NFA had the same length for both shotguns and rifles, which was 18 inches. And anyone who's aware of the law today knows that the short barrel rifle length is now 16 inches, not 18. And the reason for that is the government sold a bunch of M1 carbines that have barrels that are 16 inches. Well, they're less than 18 inches. I don't remember the exact. I think they're 16 inches, but regardless, it sold, like millions of these things after the war without realizing that it was breaking its own federal law on this and making all these people felons. And so they went through and amended the law to fix that problem. Although I'm sure to the chagrin of many gun owners, they didn't just repeal that section of the NFA. Instead, they shortened the limit so you could have shorter rifles than you can shotguns now. But regardless, they still looked at those regulations as effectively the same thing and said, Miller, the outcome of Miller is the outcome of Rush. This case of Rush ought to be the same as the outcome of Miller. They're basically the same case. But if you, looking at Miller, they're kind of arguing the court at the time, and this is a highly controversial case if you look into the details of it, because it was there weren't oral arguments. Miller didn't have an attorney defending him at the court. He was actually dead by the time this ruling came down, if I'm remembering correctly. And now there's accusations from one researcher, actually one of the researchers who was cited in Heller, talking about Miller, who now has a new paper out arguing that essentially Miller was set up for all this stuff, that the corrupt cops where he lived forced him to rob banks and then later arrested him and set up this whole case and then later murdered him. So the details of Miller are pretty bad, but the holding is fairly narrow and only looks at whether or not the short barrel shotgun itself is protected under the Second Amendment, and concludes mainly for the reason that, and this is another area of Miller that's kind of questionable, right? They conclude that short barrel shotguns are not useful in militia service, that they wouldn't be useful in military service, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense coming off of the First World War, where the trench gun, which to be fair did have, I believe, a 20-inch barrel, but generally speaking, was an extremely effective weapon, shotgun, pump action shotgun in World War I, to the point where the Germans wanted it, the use of it declared a war crime. So, Miller has a questionable reasoning around why short barrel shotguns and rifles aren't militarily useful or useful for militia service guns. And then Heller takes that conclusion and kind of twists it a little bit itself, right? Because it's Heller saying, they didn't really mean that only militarily useful guns are protected, right? What they meant was just the part about guns being in common use being protected. And so that then becomes the basis for Heller's ruling that, and Heller rightly, I think, notes that Miller's conclusions were pretty narrow. It doesn't try to purport to tell anyone what the Second Amendment really does. It just looks at whether or not it protects this particular gun. And so the only conclusion it draws is that not every gun is a protected arm under the Second Amendment, right? That's what Heller takes away from it. And they say, and the test to figure out whether a gun is protected or not is this common use test. Is it in common use for lawful purposes? If so, then it's protected. And they say, well, handguns are clearly in common use for lawful purposes. So, they're the most popular gun for self-defense in the country. Therefore, they must be protected under the standard. And then, that's where Heller comes down. Now, they don't set, as you can tell there, they don't set an actual number or anything, or a real hard line between what is commonly used and what is not. And we still don't have a line for that really today. Not from the Supreme Court, at least. There was Saitano, and you had a concurrence from, I believe it was Alito, right, where he was talking about 200,000 stun guns must meet the standard. You've had the comments from Justice Thomas that we mentioned earlier from the Illinois assault weapons ban case, where they declined to take up that case, but Thomas said, well, it must be that the most popular rifle in the country, the AR-15, is in common use. But again, that's not a majority opinion from the court. You still don't have that. We still don't have an actual standard for what common use means from the Supreme Court. We've had other lower court judges rule. And in fact, in this Seventh Circuit case, they basically said, well, no, it's not in common use, because their reasoning just reflected back to that Illinois assault weapon ban case where it's called Bevis or Bevis. I call it Bevis. Anyway, they, in that case, they said that AR-15s aren't in common use. They're the guns affected by the assault weapon ban, so-called assault ban, are not in common use. So therefore, an even smaller group of guns, short barrel rifles, even if there are hundreds of thousands of them, they can't be in common use. That's the logic in the Seventh Circuit case. But yeah, you still haven't actually had any, the court set a number or really anything. Just common use is the phrasing. They don't have a specific guide beyond that. Dangerous and unusual or common use. we don't know exactly what the court means by these things, but that is still a live standard. And if you look at Bruin, even though Bruin sets up a different test, right, or it sort of expands upon the test in Heller, because Heller's point was, oh, well, we're using the historical record here to establish that these are what this stuff means. And that's what Miller did to some degree, right? They looked at the history around the founding era to figure out who's in the militia, what kind of, were there restrictions on the guns that they used? There's a throughput through all these cases, at least a broad one. And so Miller is still good law as far as, at least as far as I could tell. And certainly that was the conclusion of the Seventh Circuit. Now, the Seventh Circuit had some other questionable conclusions too about the short barrel rifle and short barrel shotgun regulations themselves, claiming that they're there because short barrel shotguns and rifles are particularly dangerous and attractive to criminals because they're powerful and more easily concealed than rifles. So they're more powerful than like a handgun, but more easily concealed than a full length barreled shotgun or rifle, which is a bit of a stretch. I don't know. I think in practice, how concealable a short barrel rifle is. It's not something you're sticking down your pants in real life. Like the classic image of them is somebody wearing a giant trench coat, which you can conceal pretty much anything in theory underneath. And it also kind of ignores the history of the NFA because now I'm sure, there were Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns, and there may have been lawmakers that independently thought those needed to be effectively banned or highly regulated by the NFA. But additionally, the NFA originally included a handgun ban. And I think a lot of people believe that these short barrel regulations were more of a way of plugging a loophole to get around the handgun ban by just making shorter shotguns and rifles. So, and then that's sort of the argument is often that this is a vestigial element from that handgun ban that just survived the removal of the handgun ban. But anyway, regardless, I think it's fair to say that Miller still it's still there. It doesn't have a very wide, the specific finding of the case that short barrel shotguns are not protected arms is not necessarily going to apply in a lot of cases, but in a case that is literally about short barrel rifles, yeah, it probably would still make sense to hold that until the Supreme Court says otherwise.
Right.
And maybe they'll come up with a common use standard that would incorporate how many short barrel shotguns and rifles there are today. That's entirely possible if they were to go with like the 200,000 number that Alito prefers, then they'll be protected.
Or if they were to take another arms ban case, but we don't know when that's going to be.
Yeah.
So
no, we don't. But we do have some other cases from this week, right? Some cases out in the States.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the big one was the Oregon Appeals Court ruled just across the board that Measure 114, which was that ballot measure in 2022, which included a permit to purchase requirement and a magazine ban on any magazine capable of holding more than 10 rounds, as well as a closing of the so-called Charleston loophole. Basically, a sale cannot proceed until a background check fully clears. It's all included in this ballot measure. It's been, locked in court battles at both the state and the federal level ever since. It's never gone into effect. But this week, the state appeals court ruled that it was constitutional, at least under the Oregon state constitution, because it has one of its own arms guarantees. So that's a pretty considerable blow to gun rights advocates, because this has been a target of theirs ever since it was passed narrowly by the voters in 2022.
Yeah. So that may well go into effect now for the first time.
That's right. Yeah. The law gives them 30 days to appeal to the Oregon Supreme Court. I've heard that they plan to appeal, and I'm sure that they're going to try to appeal to the Oregon Supreme Court. But yeah, for the first time, it has a path to actually go into effect after, 2.5 years, almost 3 years.
Yeah. And this was an initiative that passed very narrowly, even in Oregon, right?
Yeah. It was like 1.3% or something like that. It passed by.
But there's a federal case as well, right?
There is. So the federal case actually gun rights advocates didn't fare much better. If they'll recall, this is the one where the Trump appointed judge actually said that magazines, related to our first segment, magazines are not arms as considered by the Second Amendment, and therefore it's constitutional to ban them. And then the permit to purchase that relied on Bruin dicta on, if shall issue permitting is okay, this is for carry. This is basically shall issue permitting for purchase. Therefore, it's presumably constitutional as well.
Similar logic to what we saw in the Seventh Circuit, but not backed up with like Miller as a very specific precedent that they could point to. But using similar logic in the sense that like, the Supreme Court has okayed some kinds of permitting for gun carry, so that presumably extends to other kinds of permitting around firearms. Right. So until the Supreme Court does something on that, you're probably going to see a lot more of those kind of rulings. And then we have Massachusetts, right?
I was going to say that same logic applied to the other state court case, which is Massachusetts. They actually decided two separate cases dealing with non-resident carry permits. One of them deals with the case we covered a while back. It was a state court judge ruling that a New Hampshire man that was in the course of a car accident investigation, he was found with a firearm that he legally owned from New Hampshire. But of course, New Hampshire is a permitless carry state, and Massachusetts law requires folks that aren't residents to still get a temporary non-resident permit if they want to have a gun in public in their state. And at the time of that case, they were still under their old may issue standard for granting those, and functionally no one was getting these permits. And so the Massachusetts Supreme Court tossed his charges, but they upheld charges against a very similar situation against another New Hampshire man. Same thing, car accident investigation. He informed officers that he was carrying because he was going on his way to work in Massachusetts. But his arrest happened a month after Bruin, when Massachusetts had quickly amended its carry laws to be shall issue. And the Supreme Court in this case said that no, his charges can stick because he should have tried to apply for the shall issue non-resident permit. Therefore, he's not protected by the Second Amendment to carry without a permit.
Yeah. And, there's certainly a logic there. The first law was unconstitutional, as the Supreme Court handed down, but the second one, the permitting requirements, at least, because generally speaking, the permitting requirements are not what have been the flashpoint of these Bruin response laws. Sometimes, sometimes they try to add in a few extra questionable requirements, but generally speaking, they've gone to a actual shall issue style permit system with higher bars than a lot of other shall issue ones, but still shall issue. And most of the complaints have been around the restrictions on where you can carry rather than getting a permit now. That's where the fight has moved to. But so there's certainly a logic to it that this second gentleman should have gotten the non-resident permit. Now, he may not have understood that this change had happened, right? That's not uncommon. People have a responsibility to understand the laws where they're carrying a gun, but at the same time that these are recent changes. You maybe just didn't understand what was going on. Regardless, it is a setback for gun rights activists in the sense that it doesn't require Massachusetts to recognize permits from New Hampshire or people who are basically the permitless carry status of people from New Hampshire or anything like that, which I think is more what they would have liked to see come out of it. But they first off ruled he didn't have standing because he didn't even try to apply for a permit on the second one. Now, the first one, he was very unlikely to be able to get a permit under the old system, which was unconstitutional. So the court said his charges can't stick. And they didn't extend that same sort of grace to the second guy because, there was a chance he could have gotten the permit, or he likely would have gotten the permit if he had gone through the process. So, that seemed to be the big difference, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because it's just so narrowly when he was arrested is right when they changed that law. So there's maybe some question of whether or not he was even aware that the law had changed or he's even aware of the intricacies of a may issue versus shall issue system. But yeah, to your broader point, yes, Massachusetts does not recognize any reciprocity with any other state. Their only option for non-resident carry is if you actually go through the process and get one of their permits. And so I think gun rights advocates were hoping for maybe a broader ruling that said Second Amendment rights don't end at state lines. And you don't have to get a permit from one state to another kind of a situation. But that wasn't to be at the Massachusetts.
But that's where Massachusetts having a non-resident permit probably helped them in this case. Right. Because, California, for instance, has gotten into trouble in court, not just because they don't recognize other states' permits, but because they don't issue non-resident. I think they just lost a case on this, right?
Yeah.
And so that, basically, if you weren't from California, there's no legal way to carry in California. Whereas Massachusetts, while it's much more difficult than, say, Virginia, where I am, which recognizes everyone else's permits, it's much more difficult to carry there if you're a non-resident, but it's not impossible. And you need to get the permit, or else the court, they're going to have less sympathy for your argument. And that seems to be exactly what happened here.
Absolutely. And getting into one quick headline from outside the reload that we wanted to touch on. The New York Times had an interesting story about sort of a dust up at the DOJ regarding Mel Gibson's attempt to get his firearms rights back. He was previously convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor. And under federal law, of course, that renders you, you're not able to purchase or possess a firearm permanently after that. Mm-hmm. But there was a push to, I guess, get him his gun rights back. And there was a DOJ person who was not maybe comfortable with maybe the pace in which they were pushing that forward to try to restore his gun rights because of the underlying nature of that offense. And that led to her departure from the DOJ. And it's sort of indicative of maybe the broader discussions going on.
Right. That's her claim, at least. It's a New York Times piece that, and the thing about this situation is not just, the controversy over Mel Gibson and domestic violence offenders and whether they should be able to retain or get their gun rights back at a certain point later in their lives. But it also speaks to this came up because it seems as part of the review that Donald Trump ordered the DOJ or the Attorney General Pam Bondi to undertake of executive branch gun policies, because there was initially a push to try and really use the sort of atrophied rights restoration process that exists within the DOJ. There is a process technically under the law to restore the rights of prohibited persons, right? People who have been convicted of felonies or domestic violence misdemeanors or adjudicated mentally ill. And, there is a process under the law to get your rights back if you're somebody like that, or somebody in that situation. The problem is that, one, Congress has never funded that process. So the DOJ has really never done it. And so it just hasn't happened. It appears that there was some effort, probably in response to the executive order, to find at least some people to start restoring gun rights to. And so this career official, she worked in the pardon section, but I guess was assigned to this task. And she came up with a list of, it was 95 people that she thought were good candidates for this. Effectively, I think according to her, the qualifications were essentially that your offense was nonviolent, or and that it had been, I think, several decades since it occurred, and that you had a clean record. I think those were some of the criteria she was using to come up with this list. And then she sent the list up, and it got whittled down to 9 people, which is extremely modest, right? Extremely modest use of this authority to restore people's rights. And then somebody told her she should add Mel Gibson to the list. And she didn't like that idea because Mel Gibson's crime was domestic violence. Now, Mel Gibson pled guilty to domestic violence, I think it was 2011. And then he had his record expunged in 2014, but that doesn't, as far as I understand it, doesn't, remove your status as a prohibited person under federal law. And so he has become friends with Donald Trump. He was appointed to be an ambassador to Hollywood by Donald Trump. And apparently, according to the DOJ official who was fired over this dust up, over this controversy, they told her when she said she wasn't comfortable doing that, recommending his restoration of rights, given his domestic violence history, which, by the way, they didn't need her approval for that. Apparently, I think the attorney general can just do this if she wants to. But I guess they wanted her approval. They didn't like that she wouldn't give it. And she said she was fired over that. And she was told that Mel Gibson is friends with Donald Trump, and that should be reason enough. Donald Trump wants it done. And she didn't agree with that. There apparently also was a dispute. She thought that this restoration process should be done on a case-by-case basis, whereas I guess there was others, people in the DOJ wanted it to be a more automated process, which would be a more robust reform, right? An automated process where you come up with some criteria, and anyone who meets this criteria can have their gun rights restored after X period of time. And so that was also part of the dispute, it sounds like, from this New York Times report. And so that sounds like something that would be part of this executive order review that they've been undergoing. Now, the other thing that is kind of the main news we've gotten on this review. The executive order was it was a review of these types of policies and others, at the ATF or in DOJ. It was supposed to be done in 30 days, and it's been more than 30 days, and we have not heard any news about this. Now, the only thing that the AG was supposed to do was put together a report and make recommendations for different reforms, and then they're supposed to go to the White House Policy Office, I believe. So after 30 days, not necessarily meant to be a public report. So maybe that's why we haven't gotten it. I have reached out to DOJ and asked them if they had any comment or any information or any update, and they just never responded. There haven't been any public leaks on this, although there's been a little bit of movement in court, right? You've seen some.
There's some breadcrumbs that maybe this review, even though it's been more than 30 days, is still ongoing. The DOJ filed an application with the Supreme Court requesting an extension in the timeline for when they can decide to file cert in the Range case, which obviously is the Third Circuit nonviolent felon case, essentially saying
Range,
they don't know.
By the way, Range would be a sort of a perfect candidate for this sort of rights restoration project, given that he can't own guns because he lied on a food stamp form in the 90s, right? Like he didn't commit domestic violence like Mel Gibson did. This is a person who committed a very nonviolent crime a very long time ago for a very small amount of money. It was like $2,000, which is more in 90s dollars than $20, $25, but still is not a major crime. And he didn't even spend any time in jail, right? But regardless, and maybe his name is on that list of 9 people that the Times reported. Although, of course, then you get into the question of whether that's good strategy for gun rights activists. They may want instead to see that case at the Supreme Court rather than kind of getting short-circuiting years of litigation by giving them what they want in a practical sense and what Brian Range would certainly want. But then you'd have to start the whole legal process over again. But anyway, it's just a side note, but yeah.
Yeah. So they just basically requested more time because they haven't, quote, decided whether or not they're going to seek cert in the case in the first place. So it seems that this sort of review of their positions and their legal strategy in Second Amendment cases is still ongoing because this happened after the 90-day deadline had ended.
Yeah. I have a source that says there's been an extension. It's hard to say for sure. I don't have multiple, so I can't confirm. I haven't seen any other reporting on this yet. So they may be, 30 days is pretty fast to try and implement all of these reforms that they were looking at. We'll see what happens. That was the deadline. Technically Trump said he was going to do a lot of this stuff in his first week, right? And that didn't happen, but doesn't mean it won't happen, I guess is kind of the the thing here. They're not living up to their timelines at this point, but doesn't necessarily mean they won't live up to the policy action they promised. But we will be covering that and keeping watch of it and making sure that you guys know what's going on one way or the other whenever it happens. But I think that's all we've got for you this week. We are going to hand it over to myself so we can get to this new segment of shorter interviews here. All right. I have Senator Mike Crapo from Idaho here with me, who has sponsored several pieces of gun legislation in this new Congress here. And welcome to the show, Senator. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Stephen. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. We're going to dive into a couple of pieces of legislation, maybe a little bit of your view on where you see these things headed, and perhaps overall strategy for you and your colleagues on gun policy in this Congress. So first off, you introduced the Hearing Protection Act, which is a sort of a staple, a high priority issue for a lot of gun rights advocates around the country. Most of the gun rights groups have been backing this for quite a while now. Can you just give us an explanation of what the bill would do in practice and why you decided to introduce it this year?
Yeah, this is a very simple, straightforward bill that all gun owners will understand quickly. That is, it changes the regulation of suppressors so that they aren't subject to this incredibly overextensive federal regulatory system with a $200 stamp you have to buy and an endless delay to get approved to purchase a suppressor, and makes it so that you can purchase a suppressor just like you purchase a firearm. You go into a dealer and you pick out your suppressor, and you have to go through a national instant criminal background check, which is instant, and you can walk out with your suppressor. It'll also be less costly. There will be a tax that is paid, but it's paid into the Pittman-Robinson Fund, which is then going to go to conservation efforts rather than to building up the bank of the ATF. Okay,
so it moves silencers, often called silencers,
yes,
but people prefer calling them sound suppressors because silencers is a bit of a misnomer. It doesn't
exactly.
Really
and the reason that we call it the Hearing Protection Act is because, again, shooters know this. The decibel level at which a firearm discharges can be damaging to your ears. And so one of the things that shooters often do, in fact, always should do, is use either earplugs or ear muffs to protect themselves. What suppressors do is they don't make the gun entirely silent like Hollywood makes it look. They reduce the level of decibels by an average of about 20 to 30 decibels per discharge. And that makes the maximum discharge amount somewhere in the neighborhood of the sound of a jackhammer. So there is a sound still, but it's not one that is damaging to the ears. In fact, it makes it basically equivalent to what it would sound like if you were wearing earmuffs or ear protectors. And I should also say that the national audiologists are in support of this bill because of the impact it has on hearing health. Right. As are the Gun Owners of America and the NRA and the National Shooting Sports Foundation. So this is something that's very broadly welcomed in the shooting industry.
Certainly. There's definitely been a top priority there for a while. So this takes essentially those devices, moves them from the National Firearms Act that regulates things like fully automatic machine guns and short barrel rifles, and it moves them into a regulatory status that's much closer to a traditional firearm that most people would own.
That's correct. That's absolutely right.
Okay. And so, and there's no major changes to this legislation this year from previous years, previous proposals?
No, it's the same. And we are continuing to push aggressively to get it enacted. As you might guess, the other side of the aisle opposes it mostly because they think of it as something that's going to let criminals run around like Hollywood shows and commit crimes with guns and nobody can hear them or know what they're doing, which is, as I said earlier, just exactly the opposite of what the reality is. The reality is this is to try to help shooters have a safer and more healthy experience as they shoot firearms.
Right. And right now there's about 29 co-sponsors. There's you and 29 other senators. They're all Republicans at this point. Last time around, I think it was exactly the same level of support for the previous year. You have made some gains from 2 or 3 years ago where it was, under 20 co-sponsors. Are you expecting to be able to get to even, the full Republican caucus, for instance, backing this, or do you expect it to come up for a vote? Where are you seeing this bill going?
I'm hoping that we will get most, if not all, of the Republicans. As you can guess, the effort to try to characterize this bill as something different than what it is makes it a little bit tough for some of my Republican colleagues who may be in states where it's not as well understood. And so I'm recognizing that political reality. The reality is we won't be able to pass the legislation until we get the ability to defeat a filibuster. So
you need 60 votes, right?
That's 60 votes. And in this Congress, I think we could get 53 or maybe 54 or 55 votes. My effort is going to be to try to get on the Democrat side another 6 or 7 senators to say yes. And I think that's maybe a long shot, but it's not something that couldn't be done. And frankly, if the interest groups like the ideologists and others who have a legitimacy that's different from the firearms industry's perspective can help on that. And we're seeing that's the reason our numbers are growing, is because the understanding of what this bill really is growing.
That's interesting. So you think on the one hand, you've got some doctors who come out in support of this concept that sound suppressors really do reduce hearing loss, as the name of the bill implies. But on the other hand, though, you've had obviously very high-profile killing earlier this year. The United Healthcare CEO's murder involved a suppressor. Now, that was it appears a 3D printed suppressor, so really kind of outside the bounds of any of this, I suppose. But could be a political setback. What do you think is going to work out as far as the balancing those two things?
Anytime there is a shooting that involves a suppressor, it is going to create some pushback. You're absolutely right. I would note that I don't think that the suppressor stopped that killer in any way or aided that killer in any way. It didn't hurt or help. He happened to have one, but it wasn't the suppressor that was the reason that he was able to take those actions. And I think that the fact that we have to do that explanation is something that is going to be harder to help us make it harder to help us get over the 60 line. But I also believe that the more opportunities we have to discuss this and the more groups that are not necessarily shooting sports groups jump in and help, the better chance we have to socialize the true facts about these issues.
So from your point of view, it's more of an education issue in Congress where people have misimpressions about what exactly suppressors do, and perhaps you can cut through that with just better advocacy. Is that what you're hearing? What you're saying?
I do believe that. I will also acknowledge that there is a huge anti-gun presence in Congress as well. It's mostly on the Democrat side, but they really don't want people to own firearms, and there is those who don't want people to own firearms are not going to be convinced to support this bill just because they are against the basic usage of firearms. And so we do have that fight. But I think that there are a number of Democrats who are not in that camp and who are probably willing to be open to these arguments as long as these arguments can be documented and validated by other groups. And that's what I'm going to be trying to work on.
Okay. And so do you see this making it perhaps into legislative deal-making situation where it's part of a larger package? What's your thought on strategy here for this? Well,
we have a number of pieces of legislation that deal with firearm policy. And it could be that there is a bigger firearm policy piece of legislation that comes together. Another thing that could be done, at least for a short-term fix, is working with the administration for executive orders to back this kind of thing up so that we can get the policy put into place and then hopefully get the decision-making justified by living with that policy for a while and showing that it does not increase gun violence. So there's a number of different strategies that we can take, but it is definitely possible that a firearms group of bills could be moved if we get the kind of momentum that we are all trying to work to develop here.
Because obviously, with the margins the way they are in both the House and Senate, it looks like a tough path, right?
Yeah, I'll be honest, it is. With the margins as close as they are, it is tough. But that doesn't mean we don't need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And we don't need people across this country to be much more vocal about explaining why the need for this is so real.
Okay. And so speaking of some of these other pieces of legislation, you just co-introduced one with your colleague in Idaho there called the ATF Accountability Act. Can you explain what that would do as well?
Yes, there are several bills there, and that Senator Risch, my colleague here in Idaho, and I have worked on together. These were introduced by him, and I'm a co-sponsor of his. One is to require, right now, the purchase of a firearm the records for the purchase of a firearm is required to be maintained by gun dealers when they sell a gun. And those records are maintained for decades and decades. And there's no reason for that. In fact, the reason to try to push those records to be maintained is to develop a national firearms registry so that we know who owns guns, or at least who purchased guns, for a time when a more left-leaning administration and Congress could perhaps try to ban guns. And that might sound like a scare tactic, but it's not unreal at all. There are efforts in Congress by those who want to see firearms banned, or to see restrictions on their ownership significantly increased. And our legislation would require that those records be disposed of at regular intervals. There are several kinds of bills. Some say that they don't have to be disposed of until the gun dealer goes out of business or shuts his business down. I think that's too long. I think a period of years, 5 years or whatever, is the right time period. But we are working to try to create a time frame in which the records as to who owns firearms in this country are not maintained and, frankly, delivered to the FBI.
Okay. So, because, obviously that's, you articulated the common critique of keeping these NICS records around.
Yeah.
But obviously on the other side, people will argue that that's necessary for tracing firearms recovered in crimes.
Correct.
Do you think that's overblown? These older records just aren't as useful for that, or what's your view on it?
I see those two positions as in conflict. I don't think one can explain it away. I think it obviously does help the FBI if they are able to connect a specific firearm to a specific crime. But I don't think that just the ownership of a firearm will allow that. That requires additional information about those firearms to be collected. And you are probably aware they do collect that additional information on firearms these days. And so there's an effort to try to collect enough information about firearms so that if the FBI or law enforcement agencies need to be able to track the ownership of a specific firearm, they can. I can't tell you that we can avoid that conflict, but I come down on the side of saying that firearm ownership is a private matter, and we should not require that those records be kept for decades.
Okay, so this idea that this sort of a de facto distributed registry, having to keep basically every sale record for decades and decades, that's a bigger concern than what the potential effect on tracing crime guns.
Yes, I do, and I come back to this point. The ownership of a firearm, the right to bear arms, is a constitutional right, and the creation of a list that could lead to banning that ownership, if those efforts were undertaken, is a direct threat to a real, legitimate constitutional right. And I think that is what trumps everything, if you will. It makes it so that we should, if we have to lean one way or the other on this issue, we lean in favor of protecting the unrestricted right to bear arms, except for the reasonable restrictions that our courts, the Supreme Court, have said are appropriate. And the Supreme Court has not said that keeping a gun registry is an appropriate restriction. Right.
That's true. And one of the other aspects of this legislation that you've that you've co-sponsored here, the ATF Accountability Act, would seek to reduce processing times as they exist already today. I will say the ATF has, it appears, done a fairly good job of reducing processing times on suppressors. In recent years, they've switched over to an electronic system that seems to have helped decrease the backlog. But you want to see more done in that regard?
Yes. What this legislation does in that regard is primarily focused on appeals of NICS background checks. So if someone fails a NICS background check for some reason and wants to appeal that process is very, very cumbersome. And what this legislation seeks to do is, if you can do a NICS background check in literally minutes for a purchase of a firearm, why can't you do and manage the appeal of a NICS background check that says that you failed? So to give the person an opportunity to correct the record about themselves without making them go through a very, very long and cumbersome process.
Right. Because there can be false positives and,
That's right.
and mistakes in the NICS system, which does have millions upon millions of records. So,
That's right.
Okay. Last question here for you, because I know you have a time crunch, a hard out here. Do you see, something like that? Maybe it could be part of a, it's not the big ticket item necessarily, but it sounds like something that may be able to draw more bipartisan support. You guys passed the Explore Act at the end of the last Congress, even after the election happened, and that expanded ranges on public land.
Yes.
Do you see something like that that's perhaps more realistic to expect to get through this Congress, or? What is your view?
There is one more set of gun legislation. There's a lot of other gun legislation going on, but there is one more set of gun legislation that actually is going to have a hearing, I believe, and maybe even a markup in the Banking Committee. And this is legislation dealing with the debanking or the effort to stop financing ability for firearms manufacturers and ammunition manufacturers. This started back in the Obama days. When
Operation Choke Point,
when they went in and tried to use federal regulators to force banks and other financial entities to stop providing loans or financing, stop financing the manufacturing or anything else for firearms and ammunition. And frankly, they went after a lot of other industries as well. And I don't understand how they picked the industries that were bad industries.
Payday loans
payday loans. And
like
they even got stamp collectors. I don't know quite why they did the big long list that they did, but firearms were on there. Mm-hmm. And we have legislation now that the Banking Committee is working on that would stop that practice. And basically, there's a number of ways that that's done by regulators, and this would prohibit that, but it would require that a legal business, particularly a constitutionally protected legal business, cannot be debanked by federal regulations or federal regulators. And it requires that something called reputational risk cannot be used to deny access to our banking industry. And reputational risk is just used to say these are industries that we don't like their reputation. And of course, firearms are often accused to be that.
Sure.
So that legislation is actually getting some movement today. And so it's possible that if that legislation gets support and becomes a vehicle, a legislative vehicle that is showing progress, we may be able to get some of these other pieces of legislation that we've discussed hooked into it. I'm not predicting anything yet, but
sure.
There are a lot of avenues that we can pursue to try to get to what we call a vehicle, a legislative vehicle that's going to get to the floor and going to get a vote and hopefully get passed.
All right. Well, look, we appreciate you coming on and giving your perspective and explaining, some of the inner workings of Congress for us, of this particular Congress. And we hope to have you back in the future again as well.
I appreciate the chance to visit with you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's all we've got for this episode. We will see you guys again real soon. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch, and so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news, and it's focused on it, and I think it's fantastic. But they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload or to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.
No